Section 23 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Milestone 14, Part 2. Gladstone was in the thick of political scrimmage over Home Rule, and he talked about it with me. "It seems the dispensation of God that I should be in the battle," he said, "but it is not to my taste. I have never had any option in the matter. I dislike contests, but I could not decline this controversy without disgrace. When Ireland showed herself ready to adopt a righteous constitution and do her full duty, I hesitated not an hour." 2 nights before, at a speech in Chester, Mr. Gladstone had declared that the increase of the American Navy would necessitate the increase of the British Navy. I rallied him about this statement, and he said, "Oh, Americans like to hear the plain truth. The fact is, the tie between the two nations is growing closer every year." It was a bitter cold day, and yet Mr. Gladstone wore only a very light cape, reaching scarcely to his knees. "I need nothing more on me," he said. "I must have my legs free." After luncheon he took me into his library, a wonderful place, a treasure house in itself, a bookman's palace. The books had been arranged and catalogued according to a system of his own invention. He showed many presents of American books and pictures sent to him. "Outside of America there is no one who is bound to love it more than I do," he said. "You see, I am almost surrounded by the evidences of American kindnesses." He gave me some books and pamphlets about himself, and his own Greek translation of Jesus, Lover of My Soul. Mrs. Gladstone had been obliged to leave before we returned from our walk. Mr. Gladstone took me into a room, however, and showed me a beautiful sculptured portrait of her, made when she was 22. "She is only 2 years younger than I am, but in complete health and vigor," he said proudly. He came out upon the steps to bid me good-bye. Bareheaded, his white hair flowing in the wind, he stood in the cold, and I begged him to go in. I expressed a wish that he might come to America. "I am too old now," he said, wistfully, I thought. "Is it the Atlantic you object to?" "Oh, I'm not afraid of the ocean," he said, as though there were perhaps some other reason. "Tell your country I watch every turn of its history with a heart of innermost admiration," he called after me. I carried Gladstone's message at once, going straight from Hawarden to America, as I had intended when leaving London. I was prepared for a reception in Brooklyn on my return, but I never dreamed it would be the ovation it was. It becomes difficult to write of these personal courtesies, as I find them increasing in the progress of my life from now on. I trust the casual reader will not construe anything in these pages into a boastful desire to spread myself in too large letters in print. When I entered the 13th Regiment Armory on the evening of February 7, 1890, it was packed from top to floor. It was a large building with its 3 acres of drill floor and its half-mile of galleries. There were over 7,000 people there, so the newspapers estimated. Against the east wall was the speaker's platform, and over it in big letters of fire burned the word, "Welcome." On the stage when I arrived at 8 o'clock were Mayor Chapin, Colonel Austin, General Alfred C. Barnes, the Rev. J. Benson Hamilton, Judge Clement, Mr. Andrew McLean, the Rev. Leon Harrison, ex-Mayor Whitney, the Hon. David A. Booty, U.S. Marshal Stafford, Judge Courtney, Postmaster Hendricks, John Y. Culver, Mark D. Wilbur, Commissioner George V. Brower, the Rev. E. P. Terhune, General Horatio C. King, William E. Robinson, and several others. The trustees of the Tabernacle, like a guard of honor, came in with me, and as we made our way through the crowd to the stage, the long-continued cheering and applause were deafening. The band, assisted by the cornetist, Peter Alley, played Home, Sweet Home. For a few minutes I was very busy shaking hands. The most inspiring moment of these preliminaries was the approach of the most distinguished man in that vast assembly, General William T. Sherman. He marched to the platform under military escort while the band played Marching Through Georgia. Everyone stood up in deference to the old warrior. Handkerchiefs were waved, hats flew up in the air, and everyone was so proud of him, so pleased to see him. Mayor Chapin introduced the general, and as he stood patiently waiting for the audience to regain its self-control, the band played Auld Lang Syne. Then in the presence of that great crowd he gave me a soldier's welcome. I remember one sentence uttered by Sherman that night that revealed the character of the great fighter when he said, "The same God that appeared at Nazareth is here tonight." But nothing on that auspicious evening was so great to me as when Sherman spoke what he described as the soldier's welcome. The building of the new tabernacle, my third effort to establish an independent church in Brooklyn, went on rapidly. We were planning then to open it in September 1891. The church building alone was to cost $150,000. Its architectural beauty was in accord with the elegance of its fashionable neighborhood on "the Hill," as that residential part of Brooklyn was always described. The Hill was unique. When people in Brooklyn became tired of the rush and bustle of life, they returned to Clinton Avenue. It was an idyllic village in the heart of the city. The front yards were as large as farms. New Yorkers describe this locality as Sleepy Hollow. On this account, during my absence, there had developed in the neighborhood some opposition to the building of the new tabernacle there. Some of the residents were afraid it would disturb the quiet of the neighborhood. They opposed it as they would a baseball park or a circus. They were afraid the organ would annoy the sparrows. The opposition went so far that a subscription paper was passed around to induce us to go away. As much as $15,000 was raised to persuade us. These objections, however, were confined to a few people, the majority realizing the adornment the new church would be to the neighborhood. When I returned, I found that this opposing sentiment had described us as the tabernacle rabble. I was in splendid health and spirits, however, and refused to be downcast. During my absence, our pews had been rented, realizing $18,000. The largest portion of these pews were rented by letter, and the balance at a public meeting held in Temple Israel. The second gallery of the church was free. The highest price paid in the rental for one pew for a year was $75. The lowest was $20. In the interval, pending the completion of the church, pew holders were given tickets for reserved seats in the Academy of Music, where our Sunday services were held. There were 1,500 free seats in the second gallery of the new tabernacle. It was a great joy to find that the enterprise I had inaugurated before sailing for the Holy Land had made such good progress. But we were always fortunate. I recall that my congregation was surprised one morning to learn that Emma Abbot, the beautiful American singer, had left a bequest of $5,000 to the Brooklyn Tabernacle. I was not surprised. I had received a private note from her once expressing her kindly feeling toward our church and promising, in the event of her decease, to leave some remembrance to us. She always had a presentiment that her life was to be short, and this always had a very depressing effect upon her. Her grief for her husband's death hastened her own. She loved him with all her heart. She was a good woman. Mr. Beecher was a kind and loyal friend to her in her obscurer days. In those days Mr. Beecher brought her over from New York and put her in care of a Mrs. Bird in Brooklyn. Until she went abroad she was helped in her musical education by these friends. She attended Mr. Beecher's prayer meetings regularly. Everyone who met her felt that she was a noble-hearted woman of pure character and sweet soul. On February 9, 1890, I preached my first sermon since my return from the Holy Land in the Academy of Music. It was expected that I would preach about the country of sacred memories that I had visited, but I was impressed with what I had found on my return in religious history of a more modern purpose. They had been fixing up the creeds while I was abroad, tracing the footsteps of divine law, and I felt the importance of this fact. So I chose the text in Joshua chapter 6, verse 23. And the young men that were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had. I did not read the newspapers while I was away, so I was not familiar with all the discussion. I understood, however, that they were revising the creed. You might as well try to patch up your grandfather's overcoat. It would be much better to get a new one. The recent sessions of the presbytery had been divided into two parties. One was in favor of patching up the old overcoat, the other in favor of a new one. Dr. Briggs had pointed out the torn places, at least 5 of them. He had revealed it, shabby and somewhat threadbare. Presbyterians had practically discarded the garment. Why should they want to flaunt any of its shreds? So I agreed with Dr. Briggs that we had better get a new one. The laying of the cornerstone of the new tabernacle took place on the afternoon of February 11, 1890. It was a modest ceremony because it was considered wise to defer the festivities for the dedication services that were to occur in the church itself in the spring. The 2 tin boxes placed in the cornerstone contained the records of the church organization from 1854 to 1873, a copy of the Bible, coins of 1873, newspaper accounts of the dedication of the old tabernacle, copies of the Brooklyn and New York newspapers, photographs of the trustees, a 25-cent gold piece from the Philadelphia Mint with the Lord's Prayer engraved on one side, drawing and plans of the new tabernacle, and some colonial money dated 1759, 1771, 1773, 1774. During my trip in the Holy Land I had secured 2 stones, one from Mount Calvary and one from Mount Sinai, which were to be placed in the tabernacle later. The tabernacle rabble, as the Philistines of Clinton Avenue called us, continued to meet in the Academy of Music with renewed vigor. My own duties became more exacting because of the additional work I had undertaken, of an editorial nature, on 2 periodicals. Of course my critics were always with me. What man or thing on earth is without these stimulants of one's energy? They were fair and unfair. I did not care so much for my serious critics as my humorous ones. Solemnity when sustained by malice or bigotry is a bore. Some call it hypocrisy, but that is too clever for the tiresome critic. Frequently in my scrapbook I kept the funny comments about myself. Here is one from the Chicago American, published in 1890. When Talmage the Terrible shouts his Godspeed to illiterate and worse immigration, who knows but his far-seeing mind feels a need of recruits for his mixed congregation? And when he, self-made gateman of heaven, says he's glad to rake in on his free invitation the fit and the unfit, the good and the bad, put it down to his tall imagination. Pan. My critics were particularly wrought up again on my return from Palestine over my finances. What a crime it was, they said, for a minister to be a millionaire. Had I really been one, how much more I could have helped some of them along. Finally, the subject became most wearisome, and I gave out some actual facts. From this data it was revealed that I was worth about $200,000, considerably short of $1 million. In actual cash, it was finally declared that I was worth only $100,000. My house in Brooklyn, which I bought shortly after my pastorate began there, cost $35,000. I paid $5,000 cash and obtained easy terms on a mortgage for the balance. It was worth $60,000 in 1890. My country residence at East Hampton was estimated to be worth $20,000. I owned a few lots on the old Coney Island Road. My investments of any surplus funds I had were in 5% mortgages. I had as much as $80,000 invested in this way since I had begun these operations in 1882. Most of the mortgages were on private residences. I mention these facts that there may be no jealous feeling against me among other millionaires. Because of my reputation for wealth, I was sometimes included among New York's fashionable clergymen. I deny that I was ever any such thing, and I almost believe such a thing never was, but I find in my scrapbook a contemporaneous list of them. Dr. Morgan Dix, of Trinity Church, with a salary of $15,000, heads the list. Dr. Brown of St. Thomas's Church received the same amount. So did Dr. Huntington of Grace Church and Dr. Greer of St. Bartholomew's. The bishop of the diocese received no more. Dr. Rainsford of St. George's Church received $10,000, and like Dr. Greer, possessing a private fortune, he turned his salary over to the church. The clergymen of the Methodist Episcopal churches were not so rich. The Bishop of New York received only $5,000. The pastor of St. Paul's on 4th Avenue received the same amount. So did the pastor of the Madison Avenue Church. The Presbyterian pulpits were filled with some of the ablest preachers in New York. Dr. John Hall of the 5th Avenue Church received a salary of $30,000. Dr. Paxton, $10,000. Dr. Parkhurst and Dr. C.C. Thompson, $8,000 respectively. Dr. Robert Collier of the Park Avenue Unitarian Church received $10,000, and Dr. William M. Taylor of the Broadway Tabernacle the same amount. I was included among these men of fashion, much to my surprise. This fact, forced upon me by contemporary opinion, did not have anything to do with what happened in the spring of 1891, though it was applied in that way. My congregation were not told about it until it was too late to interfere. This I thought wise because there might have been some opposition to my course. I kept it a secret because it was not a matter I could discuss with dignity. Then, too, I realized that it was going to affect the entire brotherhood of newspaper artists, especially the cartoonists. I shuddered when I thought of the embarrassment this act of mine would cause the country editor with only one Talmage woodcut of many years in his art department. So I did it quietly, without consultation. In the spring of 1891, I shaved my whiskers. End of the 14th milestone.